The night Harvey Monroe found a woman standing in the middle of his cornfield at midnight. He had not slept properly in 11 days, and he had begun to wonder if the drought and the loneliness were finally conspiring to make him see things that were not there. The summer of 1878 had been brutal in Caldwell County, Kansas. The kind of brutal that made a man question every decision that had led him to 160 acres of cracked earth, and a farmhouse that still smelled like the woman who had died inside it 3 years prior. Harvey was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and worn down to the grain of himself, the kind of man who rose before the sun and fell into bed after it set, and never once complained about the space in between, because complaining required an audience, and Harvey Monroe had not had one of those in a very long time. He had gone out that night because he heard something moving through the corn. He thought it was a coyote. He brought his rifle, not because he was afraid, but because a man alone on a prairie farm learned early that the difference between a coyote and a problem was sometimes only a matter of timing. What he found instead was a woman. She was standing perfectly still between 2 rows of his knee-high corn, holding a carpetbag in one hand and staring up at the moon like she was memorizing its face. She wore a dark traveling dress that was dusty at the hem, and her dark hair had come loose from whatever it had been pinned into and now hung past her shoulders in tangled waves. She did not appear to be afraid of the dark, or the isolation, or the fact that a man with a rifle had just stepped into the field 20 feet away from her. Harvey stopped walking. He lowered the rifle to his side, mostly because pointing it at a woman who appeared to be simply looking at the moon seemed like an overreaction. "Who are you?" he said. She turned to look at him. Even in the thin silver light, he could see that she had dark eyes and a face that gave very little away. "Esther Townsend," she said. He waited. She did not say anything else. She did not explain how she had come to be standing in his cornfield at midnight, or where she had come from, or where she was going. She stood there holding her carpetbag and looking at him like he was the one who had appeared somewhere unexpected. Harvey Monroe was not a man accustomed to mystery. He was accustomed to seed catalogs and fence posts and the pragmatic arithmetic of farming alone. He shifted his weight and tried again. "What are you doing in my field?" he said. She considered this for a moment, as though the question deserved real thought. "Resting," she said. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a satisfying answer, but something about the flatness with which she delivered it, something about the way she stood there like a woman who had earned whatever rest she could find in whatever field she chose to rest in, made Harvey close his mouth around the follow-up questions that had lined themselves up behind his teeth. He looked at her carpetbag. It was battered and had a leather handle that was almost worn through. He looked at her shoes, which were city shoes, good ones once, now ruined by long travel across hard terrain. "You walk here," he said. "From the road," she said. "I saw the light in the window." He had left the lantern burning in the kitchen. He always did. He was not sure why anymore. Old habit, maybe. His mother had always said a lit window was a welcome. His wife, Clara, had said the same. "The road is 2 miles south," Harvey said. "I know," Esther Townsend said, and she looked back up at the moon. Harvey stood in his cornfield at midnight with his rifle at his side, and looked at this woman who had materialized out of the dark prairie, and offered him no explanation whatsoever. And he thought, in some distant and unpracticed corner of himself, that he had no idea what to do with her. He also thought very quietly in a corner even more distant than that he was glad, in some complicated way he could not yet name, that she was there. "You can come inside," he said at last. "I have coffee." She picked up her carpetbag and followed him without a word. Harvey Monroe's farmhouse was not a beautiful place, but it was solid. He had built it himself in 1872. The year he and Clara had come out from Ohio with $200 and a wagon full of tools and an uncomplicated certainty about the future that Harvey now looked back on with the affection one reserved for things that no longer existed. The house had 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft, and Clara had hung curtains in the windows that Harvey had never taken down even after she was gone, because taking them down had seemed like an admission he was not ready to make. He set the rifle against the wall by the door and went to the stove. Esther Townsend set her carpetbag beside the door, very precisely, as though she did not want to impose any more than the weight of the bag required. She looked around the kitchen without touching anything. "You live alone," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Harvey said. He did not explain. He put the coffee on and set 2 cups on the table. Esther sat down when he gestured toward the chair. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap in the manner of a woman who had been taught that how you sat when you were tired was a measure of your character. Harvey had known women like that. His mother had been one. "Where did you come from?" he asked, sitting down across from her. She looked at him across the table. The lantern light made her face warm and complicated, and Harvey noticed that she had a small scar along her jaw, barely visible, the kind a person accumulated by living and not by being careful. "St. Louis," she said. "Before that, Philadelphia." Harvey poured the coffee when it was ready. His hands were a farmer's hands, large and calloused and not particularly graceful, and he was conscious of them in a way he had not been conscious of his hands in years. "That is a long way," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You have people out here?" he asked. "Family, someone you are going to?" She picked up the coffee cup and held it in both hands. The steam rose between them. "No," she said, and then more quietly, "not anymore." Harvey did not press. He had learned in the years of his solitude that the things people did not say were often the things they needed most to keep hold of, at least for a little while. He drank his coffee and looked at the curtains Clara had made from blue calico and thought about how strange it was that the world kept depositing things at his door that he did not know what to do with. "You can sleep in the loft," he said. "I will take the floor down here. In the morning you can tell me where you are going and I will take you into town." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. There was something in that look, something careful and assessing and faintly surprised, as though she had expected something different from him and was recalibrating. "Thank you," she said, and she said it like she meant it, like the words cost her something real. Harvey Monroe lay on the kitchen floor that night with his bedroll under him and the lantern turned down low, and the sounds of the Kansas prairie all around him. The wind through the corn, the distant coyotes answering each other across the dark. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman from Philadelphia who had walked 2 miles through the dark to stand in his cornfield and look at the moon, and who had explained nothing, and who had drunk his coffee like she was grateful for warmth. He did not sleep for a long time. When Esther came down from the loft in the morning, Harvey was already outside. She could hear the rhythmic ring of an axe splitting wood, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched him for a moment before she did anything else. He worked with the focused, economical motion of a man who had been doing the same things for so long that his body had memorized them. He was wearing a plain work shirt, the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a hat that had been expensive once and was now simply useful. He did not know she was watching. She turned away from the window and looked around the kitchen with more attention than she had managed the night before. There were 2 coffee cups in the drying rack, his and the one she had used. There was a cast iron pan on the stove, well seasoned and cared for. There was a shelf with a few books, a Bible and 2 others, and a small photograph in an oval frame on the mantelpiece above the stove. The woman in the photograph was pretty, with light eyes and a gentle expression, and she was wearing a dress that suggested the photograph had been taken at her wedding. Esther looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she found the flour and the salt and the lard, because she was a woman who expressed gratitude through action, and she set about making biscuits. Harvey came in when the biscuits were done and stopped just inside the door. He took off his hat. He looked at the biscuits on the plate and then at Esther and then back at the biscuits. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, setting the plate on the table. "Sit down." He sat down. There was something almost amusing about the speed with which he obeyed, something that Esther noted in her own private way and filed away alongside the other things she had observed about Harvey Monroe: that he had left a lantern burning, that he had not asked too many questions, that he had given her his bed and slept on the floor without making her feel that she owed him anything for it. They ate the biscuits with the last of his honey and drank coffee, and the morning came in through the window, pale and promising. The drought had not broken, but mornings in Kansas in the summer were still beautiful in the way of things that existed before the heat arrived, gold and wide and alive with bird noise. "The town is Millard Creek," Harvey said, "4 miles northeast. I can take you in the wagon this afternoon." Esther put down her biscuit. "I would like to stay," she said. Harvey looked at her. "Stay," he said. "If that is acceptable," she said. She said it the way a woman said something she had thought about carefully and arrived at with conviction, not the way a woman asked permission. "I can cook and clean and keep a garden. I can do accounts if you have any. I am not afraid of work." Harvey put down his coffee cup. He looked at this woman across his kitchen table, this woman who had materialized in his cornfield at midnight and had still not fully explained herself, and he felt something move in him that was not quite suspicion and not quite hope, but something in between, some cautious and wounded creature of an emotion that had been living quietly in the dark of him for 3 years. "You are running from something," he said. It was not an accusation. His voice was too quiet for that. It was an observation, the same way he would observe that weather was coming or that a fence post needed attention. Esther held his gaze. "I was," she said. "I'm not sure I still am. I'm not sure there is anywhere left to run to." He was quiet for a moment. The curtains moved in a small wind from the open window. "What happened?" he said. She was quiet for longer than he had been. Outside, a meadowlark said something bright and thoughtless to the sky. "My husband died 8 months ago," she said. "He left debts, a great many debts. The men he owed came for the house, then the furniture, then everything that was inside it. His brother came after that and said I owed him for what was borrowed. I did not owe him anything, but he had lawyers and I did not, so I left before it became a different kind of problem." Harvey said nothing. "I had an aunt in Wichita," Esther continued. "I was going to her, but I received a letter in St. Louis that said she had died in April. So I kept going because I did not know what else to do. And then the stagecoach broke an axle 15 miles back, and I walked from there, and I ended up in your cornfield." She said all of this without drama, in the level and steady voice of a woman who had already grieved what there was to grieve, and had arrived, through sheer persistence, at something harder and quieter than grief, which was the question of what came next. Harvey Monroe looked at her for a long time. He thought about the 160 acres outside that had been worked by one pair of hands for 3 years and showed it. He thought about the house that was too quiet and too big for one man, and the way he had stopped noticing the curtains Clara had made, not because he had forgotten her, but because forgetting and moving were different things, and he had not yet figured out how to do either. "I have one rule," he said. She waited. "No more cornfields at midnight," he said. "At least not without saying where you are going first." Something happened in Esther Townsend's face then, something small and quick and real, something that was not quite a smile but was the private architecture of one. "Agreed," she said. The arrangement began practically enough. Esther took the loft as her room and Harvey returned to his, which was the small room off the kitchen that had always been his and Clara's, and that he had been sleeping in alone for 3 years with no particular sense that this would ever change. Esther cooked and managed the house with the competence of a woman who had once had a house of her own and had not forgotten how it worked. Harvey farmed. They ate together in the mornings and evenings and were separately occupied through the long days. Millard Creek was the nearest town, and Harvey made the drive in on Saturdays for supplies. The 3rd Saturday after Esther arrived, he told Amos Whitfield, who ran the general store and who was constitutionally incapable of keeping information to himself, that he had hired a housekeeper. He said it plainly, without elaboration, because he understood that in a small prairie town the elaboration would be provided by the community regardless of whether he offered it. He was right. By the following Wednesday, the Reverend Dyer had ridden out to the farm on a matter of propriety. Harvey met him at the fence. "People are talking, Harvey," the Reverend said from atop his horse. "People always are," Harvey said. "She is not your wife," Reverend Dyer said. "She is my housekeeper," Harvey said. "She sleeps in the loft. I sleep in my room. There is a ladder between them that is approximately 12 feet long. I trust that satisfies." Reverend Dyer looked at him with the expression of a man who suspected there was more to a situation than he could directly address. "She is a widow," he said. "She is," Harvey said. "And she is respectable." Harvey looked at the Reverend with a flatness that was not quite hostility but was the topographical neighbor of it. "She is the most contained person I have ever met," Harvey said. "And I grew up with a Quaker grandmother. Now if you have no further business, I have fence that needs mending." The Reverend went back to town and the gossip continued, as gossip does, and Harvey ignored it, as he had learned to ignore most things that could not be resolved with work. What he could not ignore was Esther herself. She was not an easy person to know. She was not unfriendly, but she kept to herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that showing too much of yourself was a liability. She was precise and capable, and she read in the evenings by the lantern light with the concentration of a woman who had been educated and was not embarrassed about it. She did not volunteer information, but she answered questions honestly when they were asked, and Harvey found himself asking them, slowly at first and then with greater regularity, like a man who has been thirsty for a long time and is finally allowing himself to drink. He learned that she was 27 years old. He learned that she had grown up in Philadelphia in a family that had been comfortable but not wealthy, with a father who had been a school teacher and a mother who had loved books. He learned that she had married at 23 to a man named Douglas Townsend who had been charming and full of plans, and that the plans had not worked out the way either of them had expected, and that she had spent 4 years discovering that charm was not the same thing as character. She asked him questions too, in her precise and unhurried way. She learned about Clara, who had died of fever in the summer of 1875, and about Ohio, and about the decision to come west that had been made by 2 people and completed by 1. She did not pity him, which Harvey found he appreciated enormously. She listened to what he said and took it seriously, and did not make the mistake of treating grief as something that required management. September arrived and brought with it a little cooler air and the beginning of the harvest, and Harvey found that having a second person on the farm made the season different in ways he had not anticipated. Esther could not do the heavy physical work of bringing in the corn, but she could drive the wagon between the rows while Harvey worked, and she could manage the sorting and the accounting and the 100 small tasks that a farm at harvest generated. And Harvey found that he talked while he worked, which he had not done in years, and that she talked back. One afternoon they were working in the field, the corn coming down around them in the golden late summer light, and Harvey said, without particularly planning to, "Do you miss Philadelphia?" Esther considered this the way she considered everything, as though the question deserved the actual answer rather than the convenient one. "I miss the library," she said. "The one on Locust Street. It smelled like leather and old paper, and I could spend the entire day there and no one would disturb me." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not miss being someone's wife," she said. "Not the way I was." Harvey nodded. He understood the particular grief of a marriage that had not been what it was supposed to be, though his grief ran in a different direction than hers. He had had something real with Clara and lost it. She had not had what was real and had lost the illusion instead. He was not sure which was harder. "What are you going to do?" he said. "After, when the harvest is settled and winter comes." Esther looked at him from the wagon seat. The light was in her eyes and she squinted slightly. "I had thought perhaps," she said carefully, "that you might be willing to continue the arrangement, if it has been useful." "It has been useful," Harvey said. Then perhaps we continue, she said. Harvey turned back to the corn. He felt something uncoil in him, something that had been wound up tight in anticipation of a different answer, and he told himself it was merely the practical relief of not having to manage the winter alone. He did not entirely believe himself. The harvest came in better than Harvey had expected, given the dry summer. Not a record yield, but enough. He took it to the grain elevator in Millard Creek in early October and came back with money in his pocket and a feeling of accomplishment that he had not had in some years, because accomplishment, he had discovered, required a witness to feel fully real. He stopped at the general store and bought a bolt of good wool fabric in dark green and a spool of thread. He told himself it was because the winter would be cold and the farm needed another blanket. He did not examine this reasoning too closely. When he came home, he set the fabric on the kitchen table and Esther looked at it and then at him. "That is good material," she said. "I thought you might want it," he said. He was looking at the fabric and not at her. "For whatever you need, a dress or a blanket or whatever." Esther stood on the other side of the table and looked at the dark green wool, and then she looked at Harvey Monroe, who was apparently very interested in his own hat, which he was turning in his hands. "Thank you," she said, and she said it the same way she had said it the first night, like it cost her something, like gratitude was a currency she had learned to spend carefully. Harvey put his hat on and went back outside, and if his ears were slightly warm, it was because October in Kansas was deceptive about the cold. Esther made herself a dress from the green wool. She wore it for the first time on the Sunday in late October when Harvey said he was going to town for church and would she like to come. She had not been to church since she arrived. He had not asked before. She came downstairs in the green dress with her hair pinned up properly and her good shoes cleaned as best they could be, and Harvey, who was standing at the door with his hat in his hand, looked at her and then looked away and then looked back. "You look well," he said, which was not, he understood even as he said it, an adequate description of what he was observing. "Thank you," she said. They drove to Millard Creek in the wagon in the early morning, the prairie flat and wide and silver gold around them. The cold had arrived properly now, and their breath made small clouds between them. Harvey had put a wool blanket on the wagon seat, and Esther had tucked it around herself with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to take warmth where it was offered. They did not talk much on the drive-in, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Harvey had always thought that silences told you more about a person than words did. With Clara, the silences had been warm and familiar. With Esther they were something else, careful and full, like a conversation that had not yet found its words. The church was a simple clapboard building at the edge of Millard Creek, and Reverend Dyer stood at the door to greet his congregation in the mild Kansas October morning. He shook Harvey's hand. He nodded at Esther with a neutrality that was its own kind of verdict. Inside, Harvey was aware that they were being observed. The town was small enough that the presence of Harvey Monroe's mysterious housekeeper in a good green dress was an event of some significance. He felt the attention like a hand on the back of his neck and did not react to it. Esther sat beside him in the pew and followed the service with the calm attention she applied to everything. When the congregation sang, she sang too, and her voice was low and clear and unexpectedly lovely, and Harvey lost the thread of the hymn entirely for a moment before he found it again. After the service, in the yard, a woman named Margaret Colby came over. Margaret was the wife of the hardware store owner and was universally understood to be the person through whom all information in Millard Creek passed before reaching general circulation. "You must be Miss Townsend," Margaret said, looking at Esther with the kind of friendly scrutiny that was not really friendly. "Mrs. Townsend," Esther said pleasantly, "though I am widowed." "Yes, Harvey mentioned," Margaret said, and looked at Harvey with an expression that conveyed several things without saying any of them. "How are you finding Kansas, Mrs. Townsend?" Margaret continued. "Very large," Esther said, "and very honest." Margaret blinked. "Honest? There is nowhere to hide from what is real out here," Esther said. The sky is too big. I find I appreciate it." Margaret looked at her for a moment and then smiled, and it was a real smile which was different from the other expression she had been wearing. "I think I like you," she said. "Thank you," Esther said. "I hope to earn it properly." Harvey drove them home in the afternoon with a sense that something had shifted. Esther had managed the town with a grace that had surprised him, though he was not sure why. She was a woman who had moved through the world, who had navigated things harder than a small Kansas church congregation, and she had brought to the enterprise the same contained and effortful competence she brought to everything. "Margaret Colby is going to talk about you," Harvey said, halfway home. "She was already talking about me," Esther said. "Now she will talk more carefully," Harvey laughed. It was a short sound, rusty from disuse, but genuine, and it surprised him almost as much as it surprised Esther, who turned to look at him with something in her expression that she did not quite cover before she turned away. Winter came down hard on Caldwell County in November, the kind of hard that made the house close in around the two people inside it, not unpleasantly. The work contracted to the essential, the animals to be cared for, the fire to be kept, the food to be cooked, and the long evenings that could not be filled with farm work filled themselves with other things. Conversation mostly. Books, sometimes. The same book passed between them and discussed when the day was done. Chess once, when Harvey found the old set under his bed still in its box from Ohio, and spent the better part of a winter evening teaching Esther the moves, and found that she learned with a speed that suggested he should not have worried about teaching her. "You have played before," he said, when she took his bishop in 7 moves. "My father taught me," she said with no apology. He liked her for it. He was increasingly aware that he liked her for quite a lot of things, and that the list was growing in ways that had begun to make him uncomfortable, not because he did not want to feel what he was feeling, but because he was not sure he had earned the right to feel it yet. One evening in December, when the wind was coming off the plains with the serious intent that Kansas wind had in the deep of winter, they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper. Harvey was reading his almanac and Esther was writing a letter, and the fire was good and the house was warm, and Harvey looked up from his almanac and watched her write for a moment. She wrote the same way she did everything, with precision and attention, her head bent slightly, her dark hair caught up but with a few strands loose at her neck. She had gotten comfortable enough over the months to sit without the rigid posture she had maintained at first, and there was something about the ease of her in the warm kitchen, the domestic reality of her presence that struck Harvey with a force he was not prepared for. He looked back at his almanac. "Who do you write to?" he said. She did not look up. "A woman I knew in St. Louis. We became acquainted when I was passing through. She was kind." "Do you have anyone?" he said. "Family, I mean." She was quiet for a moment, the pen still on the page. "A brother in Philadelphia," she said. "We are not close. He took our father's side when Douglas and I married and then took Douglas's side when things were difficult, and I have not found my way back to thinking well of him." "I am sorry," Harvey said. She put down the pen and looked at him. "Are you?" she said, not challenging, genuinely curious. "I am sorry you are alone," he said. "I know what it is." She looked at him for a moment, and something passed between them in the warm kitchen air, something real and undefended, something that both of them allowed to exist for a few seconds before Esther picked up her pen and Harvey returned to his almanac. But it was there. After that, it was there between them always. Christmas came quietly. Harvey did not usually market much, not since Clara. But Esther made a plum pudding from dried fruit she had been collecting since October, a feat of planning that Harvey only understood when he tasted the result, which was extraordinary. He had gone to town the week before and bought a small thing, a good pen, because she wrote letters and the pen she had been using was an old one that scratched and bled. He wrapped it in brown paper and left it on the table Christmas morning. She unwrapped it and held it and did not say anything for a moment. "Harvey," she said, and then stopped. "It is practical," he said, looking at the window. She stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and kissed him on the cheek. It was a brief thing, warm and exact, and it was over before Harvey had entirely registered that it was happening. She went back to the stove to check the pudding, and Harvey sat at the table with his hand half raised toward his cheek and then put it down and thought that he needed to make a decision about something. He did not make the decision that day. He let the winter continue and did not examine too closely the way he had started to feel when she came into a room, or the way the days felt different now, fuller, like days that mattered to something beyond the farm's survival. He told himself he was being careful. He told himself he owed it to the memory of Clara not to be reckless. He told himself a great many things in the long dark of a Kansas winter, and most of them were technically true, and none of them were the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler and more frightening. The whole truth was that Harvey Monroe was falling in love with Esther Townsend, and he was terrified, not because she was not worthy of it, but because he was not certain he was. In February, a man rode out from town. Harvey was in the barn when he heard the horse, and he came out to see a stranger dismounting at his fence. The man was city-dressed in a dark suit that had been good quality once and was now dusty from travel. He had a narrow face and cold eyes and the particular quality of a man who had been looking for something and had found it. He asked for Esther Townsend. Harvey looked at him and something old and careful moved in his chest. "Who are you?" Harvey said. "Name's Gerald Townsend," the man said. "I am her husband's brother. She owes me certain sums from my brother's estate, and I have been appointed to collect." Harvey looked at Gerald Townsend for a moment. He was thinking about what Esther had told him on that first morning about the lawyers and the debts and the kind of problem she had left Philadelphia to avoid. "She does not owe you anything," Harvey said. Gerald Townsend smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "I have papers," he said, and tapped the breast of his coat. "You can take your papers back to wherever you produced them," Harvey said. "There is nothing for you here." Gerald Townsend's smile did not change. "She is here," he said. "I can see by your face that she is. I have ridden a very long way, Mr. Monroe," Harvey said. "Mr. Monroe. I have ridden a long way, and I have a legal instrument that entitles me to certain compensation. I would like to speak with Mrs. Townsend." Harvey was quiet for a moment. He thought about the woman inside who had walked 2 miles through the dark carrying everything she owned in a battered carpet bag, and had stood in a moonlit cornfield and offered no explanation, because she had been tired and frightened and had run out of places to go. "Wait here," Harvey said, and went inside. Esther was at the kitchen table. She looked up when Harvey came in, and she read his face with the accuracy she had developed over months of paying attention to him. "Who is it?" she said. "Gerald Townsend," Harvey said. The color went out of her face, but she did not flinch. She sat very still for a moment and then stood up. "I will speak to him," she said. "You do not have to," Harvey said. "I know," she said, "but I am done being afraid of him." She went past Harvey to the door and he followed her out. Gerald Townsend looked at his sister-in-law with the satisfied expression of a man who has tracked something to its den. "Esther," he said. "Gerald," she said. "How did you find me?" "You are not as invisible as you thought," he said. "You stopped in St. Louis long enough to leave a forwarding address for your letters. The post office has a woman who talks." Esther looked at him steadily. "I do not owe you money, Gerald. Douglas borrowed what he borrowed from his own resources, and whatever debts he created are the debts of his estate, not mine." "You were his wife," Gerald said. "I was not his property," she said. Gerald Townsend looked past her at Harvey Monroe with the assessing look of a man who was calculating leverage. "What has she told you?" he said to Harvey. "Did she tell you she was an educated woman? Did she tell you about her father's estate?" "There was money there, Mr. Monroe, money that came to her through her mother, and my brother had claims to it that the courts agreed with, and she ran before the matter could be properly settled." Harvey looked at Esther. $200, she said quietly, looking at Harvey. "My mother left me $200. They wanted it and I did not give it, and they were going to take it by law, and so I left." She looked back at Gerald. "The $200 is in a bank in Wichita. It has been there since October. You can have it. And then you will leave." Gerald Townsend looked at her for a long moment. "That is an admission," he said. "That is a settlement," she said, "and it is the last one you will get from me. If you come back from Wichita with anything else, I will have our own conversation with a lawyer about what Douglas owed me in 4 years of a marriage I kept faithfully and he did not." The cold air sat between the three of them. Gerald Townsend looked at his sister-in-law, and whatever he saw in her face made him very quiet. "Write me the account information," he said at last. She wrote it on a piece of paper from Harvey's almanac. Gerald Townsend took it, pocketed it, mounted his horse, and rode south toward the road without another word. Harvey and Esther stood in the cold February air and watched him go. "The $200, Harvey said after a moment. "It was my mother's," Esther said. "It is the last thing I have from her." Her voice was even, but her hands at her sides were not. "I would rather have my life than the money." Harvey turned to look at her. She was standing in the gray February light with her jaw set and her eyes bright, and she was, he thought, the most remarkable person he had ever encountered in his 31 years of living. "Come inside," he said. "It is cold." She came inside. He made coffee, which was his answer to most things, and they sat at the kitchen table and drank it, and the silence between them was different from the usual kind. It had weight. It had all the things that had been building in Harvey Monroe since September, since a woman appeared in his cornfield and looked at the moon. "You could have told me," he said. "I did not want you to think I had brought trouble to your door," she said. "You brought yourself to my door," Harvey said. "I am glad of it." She looked at him across the table with dark eyes and a face that was learning slowly to give things away. "Harvey," she said. "I am not good at speeches," he said. "I am going to ask you to understand that when I say I am glad you are here, I mean it more than I know how to say." "I know," she said softly. "And I want you to stay," he said, "not as a housekeeper. I want you to stay as—" he stopped and tried again. "I want you to stay as the person you are, and I want to be the person I am, and I want us to figure out if those two things can make something." He was looking at the table. His large hands were around his coffee cup, and the cold light of February came through Clara's curtains, and he waited. "Harvey," Esther said. He looked up. "Yes," she said. It was simple and direct and entirely her. "Yes." He put down his coffee cup and reached across the table and took her hand. Her hand was smaller than his and warm from the cup, and she did not pull it back. They sat at the kitchen table in the February morning with their hands together, and the long winter quiet around them, and both of them understood that something had just changed, simply and permanently, and that it was right. Spring came to Caldwell County like a reprieve. The land greened up slowly, cautiously, as though it did not entirely trust itself after the previous summer's drought, and the sky opened up with the kind of wide blue that made Harvey understand every year why he had come west in the first place. He and Esther drove into Millard Creek in the first warm week of April and spoke to Reverend Dyer, who had the grace to look genuinely pleased, as well as privately satisfied in the way of men who had suspected a thing for some time. "I will read the banns on Sunday," Reverend Dyer said, with the brisk efficiency of a man who felt that matters of propriety, once properly addressed, ought to be completed without delay. Margaret Colby descended on Esther the following Sunday with a force of enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for this. She brought 2 other women of the town, Mrs. Alderman and a younger woman named Ruth Pierce, whose husband ran the livery stable, and the 4 of them had a conversation in the churchyard that Harvey observed from a distance with the same attentive wariness he brought to weather. Esther managed all 3 of them with her usual composed and courteous precision, and came back to Harvey's side with the expression of a woman who had survived a skirmish and come out on top. "They want to hold a supper," she said. "The whole town," Harvey said. "Margaret said it would be an occasion," Esther said. "Margaret says everything is an occasion," Harvey said. "She means well," Esther said, and this was the closest she had come to being charitable about Margaret Colby, and it indicated to Harvey that the conversation in the churchyard had gone better than it appeared. The wedding was a simple thing, and exactly right for both of them. A Saturday in late April, in the little clapboard church, with the apple tree in the churchyard beginning to show white blossoms and the wide Kansas sky doing what it did best, which was to contain everything human under it in a way that made human things feel important rather than small. Harvey wore his best coat, which was dark and fit him well enough, and Esther wore the green wool dress he had bought her in October, with a small bunch of wild prairie flowers in her hand that Harvey had driven out to the prairie at sunrise to find because flowers in April were where they were, and not where it was convenient for them to be. He had come back with them and presented them to her at the kitchen door, still in his riding clothes, with grass on his boots, and Esther had taken the flowers and looked at them, and then at him in a way that required no words to communicate. Reverend Dyer married them with the words that had been used for that purpose since before either of them was born, and Harvey took Esther's hand and said what he had to say in a voice that was quiet and very serious, and Esther said what she had to say in a voice that was equally quiet and more than equally serious. And when it was done, and Harvey kissed her for the first time properly, there in front of God and Reverend Dyer and most of Millard Creek, Esther's hand came up to his lapel and held on. And Harvey thought that if a person could choose the thing in their life that they would not undo, he had just found his. The supper that Margaret Colby had organized took place in the church hall and was, by any objective measure, far too large for the occasion. There were tables of food from the women of the town, and a man with a fiddle, and Harvey danced with his new wife on the scrubbed wooden floor while the evening came in through the open windows, and the fiddle played something sweet, and the people of Millard Creek watched them with the particular fondness that communities reserved for things that had worked out. Harvey was not a good dancer. He had never been a good dancer. Esther, it turned out, was an excellent dancer because of course she was, and she guided him through the steps with a subtlety so practiced it was almost invisible, and he followed her lead with the willingness of a man who has learned that following someone's lead is not weakness when the person knows where they are going. "You are a very good dancer," he said during a quieter moment. "Philadelphia," she said. "Is there anything from Philadelphia that was not useful?" he said. She thought about this. "Douglas," she said. Harvey laughed his rusty laugh, louder this time, and Esther Monroe, which was who she was now, looked up at him and smiled fully for the first time, a real and unguarded smile that was different from every other expression he had seen on her face, not calculated, not contained, just real. It transformed her face entirely, and Harvey looked at it and thought, with the gravity and wonder of a man who had been alone a long time and had learned what aloneness cost, that he was going to be looking at that smile for the rest of his life, and he intended to earn it as often as it could be earned. They drove home from town in the late evening, the prairie dark around them and the stars so dense overhead that the sky seemed almost solid. Esther sat beside him on the wagon seat, and her shoulder was against his arm, and neither of them moved away from the warmth of it. Harvey clucked to the horse, and the wagon rolled through the spring dark, and he could smell the green of the new season and the faint sweetness of Esther's hair when the wind moved it. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She was looking at the stars. "Are you?" "More than I have been in some years," he said honestly. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a small gesture, and he was aware of every millimeter of it. "Harvey," she said. He said. "Thank you for leaving the lantern on," she said. He understood that she did not mean just the first night, and he tightened his arm around her shoulders, and the horse walked home through the dark Kansas night under an enormous sky that did not care about human happiness and contained it anyway, the way the West contained everything. The grief and the beauty and the irreversible decisions, and the occasional, extraordinary luck of finding the right person standing in the wrong place at the right time. The summer of 1879 was different from the summer before. The rain came, for one thing, properly and at intervals, and the corn went in well and grew well, and the farm had the look of a place that was going to make it. Harvey noticed the difference in practical terms, the yield estimates, the water levels in the creek, the condition of the soil, but he also noticed it in ways that had nothing to do with agriculture. In the way the house felt when he came in from the fields, in the presence of a garden that had appeared in a space south of the house that had been bare dirt for years, in the smell of cooking that was not just sustenance but was care applied to food. Esther had made the house something he had not known it was missing. She had not replaced Clara, because that was not what was happening, and Harvey understood this clearly. What she had done was make a new thing, something that was theirs together rather than a continuation of what had been before. She had moved the photograph of Clara to the mantelpiece in the parlor, where it sat with a quiet dignity rather than a daily presence, and Harvey had found this not painful but right. She had written to her friend in St. Louis, and in the summer a letter came back with a warmth that made Esther read it twice, and then fold it carefully and put it in the small box she kept in the bedroom. She was making a life, Harvey saw, not arriving at someone else's but building her own alongside his, and the distinction mattered to her and therefore it mattered to him. In July, she told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning precisely, without preamble, in the manner of a woman who had decided not to let the thing sit unspoken any longer. Harvey was at the stove. He turned around and looked at her. She was watching him with dark eyes that were doing the private calculation they always did, reading his face for the thing he actually meant rather than the thing he might say. What he said was nothing for a moment. What he did was cross the kitchen in 3 steps and take her face in both his calloused hands and kiss her with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about his feelings on the subject. And Esther laughed against his mouth, a surprised and genuine laugh, and he thought that there it was again, that transforming smile earned by him, given freely. "A boy," he said, pulling back enough to look at her properly. She raised her eyebrows. "You do not get to choose." "I know," he said. "I just said a boy." She shook her head, but she was still smiling. It was a boy. He arrived in the first week of March 1880, during a late winter storm that kept the world wrapped in white and very quiet, delivered by Ruth Pierce, who had done this before and came out in the snow with the calm competence of a woman who understood that storms did not wait. Harvey sat on the other side of the bedroom door and listened to things that made him want to climb through it. And Ruth came out twice to tell him it was going well. And the second time the sound from inside the room changed, and Harvey stood up so fast he knocked over the chair. Ruth opened the door and said, "Come in, Harvey," and he went in. And Esther was there on the bed looking exhausted and fierce and entirely herself. And in her arms was a small red-faced person who was making the universal announcement of the newly arrived. Harvey sat on the edge of the bed beside his wife and looked at this small person and felt something move through him that he could not have described to another living soul, something so large and simple that it had no name in any language he knew. "He looks like you," Esther said. Harvey looked at the baby. The baby had dark hair and a furious expression. "He looks like himself," Harvey said. "They all say that," Ruth Pierce said from the doorway, with the benign authority of a woman who had more experience of this than either of them. "He looks like his father. They named him William James Monroe, Will, in the ordinary way of things." Harvey held him for the first time when he was 20 minutes old, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the snow still coming down outside and the lantern lit. And Will looked up at him with the unfocused but serious regard of a very new person taking in new information. And Harvey talked to him quietly about the farm and the fields and the spring that was going to come, because he could not think what else to say to someone who had just entered the world. Esther slept and Harvey kept watch, and the storm came down, and the farm was warm and full of the sound of new breathing. Spring broke properly in April, and Harvey Monroe walked out to the south field on the morning. He planned to start planting and stood at the edge of the field and looked at it, and then turned around and looked at the house, where he could see through the kitchen window the shape of his wife moving. And he thought about the 2 years that had passed since a woman appeared in his cornfield in the dark and explained nothing, and offered no satisfying account of herself, and drank his coffee like it was kindness distilled. He planted the corn. It came up good. In the fall of 1880, a conversation with Amos Whitfield at the general store turned to the question of the abandoned Riley property, 80 acres that adjoined Harvey's land to the west, which the bank in Wichita had been trying to sell for a year and had not managed to. Harvey came home and talked it over with Esther at the kitchen table, and she listened with the attention she brought to everything important. And then she got the ledger book she had been keeping since she arrived and went through it with the focused precision that had always made Harvey grateful. He had married a woman who could count. "If the price is what Amos says," she said, "and if this year's yield is what we expect, and if we borrow conservatively against the farm," she put her finger on a number in the ledger, "we can do it." Harvey looked at the number. "You are sure?" he said. "I am never certain of anything in farming," she said, "but the numbers say yes." He bought the Riley property in November. 240 acres in total, more than enough for what he had in mind. And what he had in mind was a cattle operation alongside the crops, modest at first and then growing, because the drives were still coming through the county, and the money was real for a man with the land and the stock. He hired a hand in the spring, a young man named Thomas Bright, 19 years old, who had come west from Missouri with the direct intention of being a cowboy, and had discovered that what cowboys mostly did was work, which he was not averse to. Thomas was cheerful and hardworking, and he adored Will with the enthusiasm of a young man who had grown up without younger siblings and had been waiting for someone smaller to be loyal to. Harvey taught him cattle work through the spring and summer, and Thomas turned out to have a genuine facility with horses and stock, and by fall he was a real hand in every sense. He lived in the small outbuilding that Harvey fixed up that first spring, and he ate breakfast and supper with the Monroe family, and in this way became part of the ordinary texture of their life, which was the way the West worked, the borders between family and hired and neighbor being more permeable on the prairie than in the places these people had come from. Esther was with child again by the summer of 1881, and she managed this with the same pragmatic and unprecious efficiency with which she managed everything, continuing to keep the accounts and the garden and the house and the cooking until quite late in the season, when Harvey insisted, not without considerable negotiation, that she accept more help from Ruth Pierce and Margaret Colby, who had become something like friends in the way that small-town women became friends. Through proximity and necessity and the accumulated experience of showing up, the second child was a girl. She came in February of 1882 with considerably more speed and drama than her brother had managed, arriving in such haste that Reverend Dyer's wife, who had come with Ruth Pierce, spent most of the event in the parlor rather than the bedroom for reasons of general principle. Harvey, who had some experience of the process now, was allowed to be present, and he held his daughter when she was minutes old and she was tiny and furious and perfect. They named her Clara Monroe. Harvey had suggested it quietly, one evening in the fall when they were talking about names, and Esther had looked at him for a moment, and then said, with a gentleness that was entirely hers, that she thought that was a good name, and that the woman in the photograph on the parlor mantelpiece deserved to have something named for her. Harvey had been very busy with something in the corner of the room when she said that, and he was grateful for the excuse it provided. Clara grew up knowing the name and the photograph and the story, in the way children on the prairie grew up knowing the things that had come before, not as tragedy but as history, as the long thread of things that had led to the present moment. Will grew up knowing it too, and both children understood that their father had loved a woman before their mother and that their mother had known a man before their father, and that none of this subtracted from what existed now, because the past was the river and the present was where you stood, and the river had brought you here. The spring of 1882 was a good one, and the summer better. Harvey's cattle operation was running properly now. He had 40 head of good Texas Longhorns that he had bought off a drive that came through the county, and Thomas Bright proved to be as capable with the cattle as he was with everything else, and Harvey paid him properly and treated him fairly, and Thomas stayed. Thomas, in this period, had also become somewhat moonstruck by the youngest daughter of Reverend Dyer, a young woman named Grace who was 20 years old and had very sensible opinions about most things and an unsensible affection for Thomas that she managed with the circumspection of a minister's daughter. Harvey noticed this with the attention he brought to anything happening on his land, and Esther noticed it with considerably more amusement, and they discussed it in the evenings after the children were in bed with the fond and slightly conspiratorial engagement of people who understood what that particular condition felt like. "You should say something to him," Esther said one evening. "He knows his own mind," Harvey said. "He is 21 years old and terrified of Reverend Dyer," Esther said. Knowing your own mind is not the same as acting on it. Harvey looked at his wife. She was sitting across from him in the evening light with Clara in her lap, half asleep and small and sweet-smelling, and Will's boots were by the door because Will could never be persuaded to put his boots where they belonged, and the house was full of the ordinary noise of a life being lived. "I will say something to Thomas," Harvey said. Thomas and Grace Dyer were married the following spring, 1883, in the same little clapboard church where Harvey and Esther had married, with the apple tree in bloom again in the churchyard, because April in Kansas was at least consistent about that. Harvey stood beside Thomas at the altar and felt the enormous satisfaction of watching something good happen to someone who deserved it, which was the best kind of satisfaction there was. Thomas and Grace took up residence in the outbuilding, which had been properly expanded over the winter, and which Grace immediately began to make habitable with the same instinct for nest building that seemed common to women who understood that home was not a given but a construction. The years moved. Harvey and Esther Monroe grew into their life together with the gradual and unself-conscious depth of two people who had arrived at each other after difficulty, and did not take the result for granted. They argued sometimes, in the direct way of two people who respected each other enough to disagree honestly, and resolved what they argued about with the practical orientation of people who had too much work to do to let grievances sit. Harvey learned the particular landscape of Esther's internal weather, the things she said when she was managing something difficult by herself, the way she went quiet in a different way when she was worried versus when she was merely thinking, the specific version of her contained expression that meant she needed to talk and had not yet decided to. He learned to wait, and she learned that waiting was what he did when he cared rather than when he didn't, and this understanding, once established, made everything easier. Esther learned that Harvey Monroe expressed himself primarily through action, that the fabric bolt in October and the prairie flowers on their wedding morning, and the way he fixed things around the farm before she had mentioned they needed fixing, were a language as complete and specific as the one she used with words, and she became fluent in it over time, fluent in the grammar of his hands and his habits and the patient, devoted quality of his attention. Clara got into everything. Will built things, fences and structures in the barn that were occasionally useful and always ambitious. Both children grew up working because there was work to be done, and grew up reading because Esther made books a presence in the house the way Harvey made good tools a presence in the barn, as fundamental equipment rather than luxury. In the fall of 1883, a letter came from Philadelphia, from Esther's brother James. Esther read it at the kitchen table. Harvey was there, and he watched her read it without asking, because he had learned to wait for things she was ready to say. When she put the letter down, she looked at the table for a moment. "James has been ill," she said. "He says he has thought about a great many things during his illness. He wants to know if I would allow him to write." Harvey said nothing, waiting. "I am not sure," she said. "What does your heart say?" Harvey said. It was not the kind of thing he said often, which made it land more cleanly when he did. Esther looked at him. "It says that holding a grudge is a weight I can put down," she said slowly, "and that I have enough to carry and choose not to." She wrote back to James. The correspondence was careful at first, the letters of two people feeling their way towards something that had been damaged and might possibly be rebuilt. James was contrite in the manner of a man who had been confronted by his mortality and found his behavior wanting. Esther was measured and honest in the manner she brought to everything, not pretending more warmth than she felt, but leaving the door open in the specific way of a woman who had experienced enough loss to understand that walking away from something that might become real was its own kind of waste. By the spring of 1884, the letters had gotten easier. By summer, James wrote that he was thinking of coming west. Harvey, when Esther told him, raised his eyebrows a fraction. "He is welcome," Harvey said, "if you want him to come." "I think I do," Esther said. "I think I want to know if we can be what we were. Before everything." James Sutton came to Kansas in September of 1884. He was a thin, careful man who looked enough like Esther that Harvey could see the family in his face, and he arrived with a politeness that was neither effusive nor casual, but that had the quality of something sincerely meant rather than performed. Harvey shook his hand and gave him the room that Thomas and Grace had vacated when they built their own proper house on the west parcel in the spring. James stayed 2 weeks. He met Will, who was 4 years old, and immediately took to him with the indiscriminate friendliness of a child who had no reason to be cautious. He met Clara, who was 2 and did not take to anyone except on her own schedule, and took to James in approximately 3 days. He ate at their table and worked alongside Harvey in the fields with the awkward but willing efforts of a city man confronting agriculture for the first time. He and Esther talked. Harvey did not know what was said. He did not need to. He could tell by the way Esther moved through those 2 weeks, the incremental lightening of something she had been carrying, and that was enough. James left on a Wednesday morning in October, and at the fence where his hired horse was waiting, he shook Harvey's hand. "You have made her happy," James said. It was quiet and direct and without caveat. "She has done that herself," Harvey said. "I only tried to stay out of her way while she did it." James looked at him for a moment and then smiled, a smile that had his sister's quality of being real rather than performed. "Thank you for leaving the lamp on," James said. Harvey was still thinking about that when he went back inside. Esther was at the window watching her brother ride toward the road. Harvey came and stood beside her. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. She leaned back against him slightly, which was the way she did things, with precision and intention. His hand came up to her shoulder. They stood and watched until James was a small figure on the horizon and then gone, absorbed by the wide Kansas distance that absorbed everything eventually. "Harvey," she said. He said. "I am glad I got lost," she said. He was quiet for a moment, his hand warm on her shoulder. "So am I," he said. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because years never are, and the prairie in particular offered its challenges with democratic consistency. A hard winter in 1885 that took 2 of their cattle and kept the family close to the house for 6 weeks. A dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights in the dry summer of 1886 that required Harvey to spend 2 unpleasant days in a Wichita courtroom with a lawyer named Frank Elias who was competent and expensive. And a period of illness in the fall of 1887 when Will got scarlet fever, and the house was very quiet in the particular way of houses with a sick child, and Esther and Harvey took turns at his bedside through 2 weeks of fever that felt much longer. Will recovered. He was 6 years old and had the resilience of the very young and the children of people who worked hard, and he came through the fever thinner and paler, and interested in telling anyone who would listen about the experience, which his sister listened to with the expression of a child who suspected she was being shown off too. Through all of it, Harvey Monroe and Esther Monroe showed each other what they were made of, which was the true work of a marriage, not the ceremony and not the first months, but the sustained daily project of choosing each other in the ordinary and difficult conditions of an actual life. They were good at it. They were good at it because they had both arrived at each other with enough experience of what the alternatives looked like that they understood, without having to articulate it, what they had. Harvey said this to Thomas one afternoon in the summer of 1887, when they were mending fence on the west parcel, and Thomas was in the particular distracted state of a man with a first child on the way. "You worry a lot," Harvey observed. "That seems correct," Thomas said, driving a staple with rather more force than was necessary. "Grace is healthy and the baby will come when it comes," Harvey said. "I know," Thomas said. "And after that," Harvey said, setting another post, "you will spend the rest of your life being glad about it. That is the whole thing, Thomas. You just have to wait for the gladness to catch up to the fear." Thomas drove another staple and looked at the fence line. "Were you afraid?" he said. "When Will came?" Harvey thought about it honestly. "Terrified," he said. "And then he was there and I was still terrified, but it was a different kind. The kind you can bear." Thomas nodded, as though this made sense in the way things made sense when they confirmed what you already suspected. Thomas and Grace's boy arrived that fall and was named Henry, and Harvey held him when he was a day old with the ease of a man who had done this before, which was a thing he had not thought, years ago, that he would have occasion to say. The autumn of 1888 was a good one for Harvey Monroe. His cattle were up to 60 head, his corn had come in well. His son was 7 years old and learning the farm with the serious application of a boy who wanted to know how everything worked, and his daughter was 6 and reading with the concentration of someone who had found something she intended to be good at and was going to be. One evening in October, when the light was the particular gold of the later afternoon, and the harvest was in, and the accounts were settled, and the work of the season was done, Harvey and Esther sat on the bench outside the kitchen door that Harvey had built the previous spring because Esther had mentioned once that she would like somewhere to sit in the evenings when the weather was good. The prairies spread south of them in the October light, the stubble fields and the distant line of cottonwoods along the creek, and the enormous sky beginning to shade pink at its far edge where the sun was going. Will and Clara were somewhere inside, audible in the way of children who have been told to occupy themselves, which they were doing by the sound of it with some disagreement about the rules of a game. Esther was reading. Harvey was not doing anything in particular, which was a thing he had gotten better at over the years, the art of not working, the art of just being somewhere in a moment that was not requiring anything of him. He looked at her. She had a line between her brows when she read, a slight furrow of concentration that he had been looking at for nearly a decade. Her dark hair had a few silver threads in it now, just a few, barely visible, and she wore it differently than she had in the first years, more easily, less pinned. She was 37 years old, and she was the most interesting person Harvey Monroe had ever been given the considerable good fortune to know. "What are you reading?" he said. She showed him the spine. It was a novel, one of the ones from the growing shelf of books that had accumulated in the parlor since Esther Monroe had been in charge of acquiring things. "Is it good?" he said. "Very," she said. "Will you tell me about it later?" She lowered the book and looked at him with that look, the direct and private look she had given him since the beginning, since across a kitchen table in February when everything had shifted. "Yes," she said. He turned back to the prairie. The pink was deepening at the horizon and the first star was appearing above the eastern edge of the sky, small and certain. The cottonwoods moved in the evening wind. "Harvey," Esther said after a moment. He said, "Do you remember what you said to me that first morning?" She said, "After Gerald had gone, you said you wanted us to figure out if two people could make something." "I remember," he said. "We made something," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the prairie with her book closed in her lap and her face open in the evening light in the way it had taken a long time to become open. And she was, he thought, everything she had been on that first night, and also everything she had become since. And the distance between those two things was the distance they had traveled together. And it was real, and it was his, and it was hers. "We did," he said. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat on the bench outside the kitchen door with the October prairie spreading out before them, and the children arguing inside about the rules of a game, and the star getting brighter in the east, and the last of the day going gold, and then pink, and then the deep and quiet blue that was the color of the Kansas sky at the end of a day that had been good. The years went on, as years do, piling up one behind the other with the comfortable generosity of time well spent. Well, Monroe grew into his father's height and his mother's precision, a boy who became a young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's eyes, and a particular quality of his own that was neither of theirs but was simply him, the thing that children became when they were allowed to. He took to the farm with a genuine vocation, not because Harvey expected it, but because the land had gotten into him young, the way the prairie did with some people, with a permanence that was not obligation but love. Clara Monroe had her grandmother's name and her mother's intensity, and a talent for reading that Esther cultivated with the specific attention of a woman who understood what access to books had meant to her own life and intended her daughter to have more of it. Margaret Colby, who had mellowed in her understanding of Esther Monroe from the first careful inspection in the church yard to something close to genuine affection, started lending the girl books from her own collection when the school's library was exhausted, and Clara received them with the reverence they deserved. Esther taught school for 2 terms in the early 1890s, when the teacher the district had hired left to marry a man in Abilene, and the town found itself without adequate instruction for its children. She was good at it, precise and demanding and fair, and Harvey organized the farm around her hours without being asked, because this was what they did, adjusted for what the other needed without requiring that the need be formally declared. In the spring of 1892, Harvey found Esther standing in the south field one evening, in nearly the same spot where the cornfield had been in 1878. She was standing with her hands at her sides looking at the prairie to the south, which was green and good in the spring evening. "What are you doing out here?" Harvey said, coming up beside her. She turned to look at him. She was 41 years old, and there was more silver in her hair now, and she was, if it was possible, more herself than she had been at 27, more settled in her own skin, more comfortable in the particular territory of who she was. "Remembering," she said. He stood beside her and looked south, toward the road 2 miles away, the road she had walked up 14 years ago in her ruined shoes with her battered carpet-bag. "It was a long walk," he said. "It was," she said. "Were you afraid?" he said. She considered it. "Yes," she said, "but I had been afraid for so long by then that the fear had changed. It had gotten quieter. I was mostly just—" She paused, choosing the word tired. Harvey nodded. "And then you came out with your rifle," she said, "and you looked so much more alarmed by me than I was by you that I felt considerably better." He turned to look at her. "I was not alarmed," he said. "Harvey," she said. "I was," he said, "extremely." She smiled. Her smile had not changed. It still had that quality of being entirely real, and it still did to Harvey what it had done since the first time he saw it, which was to make everything that was complicated about his internal life briefly and completely simple. "You offered me coffee," she said. "It was the only thing I could think of," he said. "It was enough," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood in the south field in the spring evening with the prairie all around them and the farm at their backs, the solid farmhouse and the good barn, and the house where Thomas and Grace lived on the west parcel, and the sound of Will somewhere in the distance talking to the horses in the manner he had of talking to animals as though they were rational participants in a conversation. "Harvey," Esther said. He said. "I think we are very lucky," she said. He looked at the sky, which was doing its evening thing, pink and gold and so wide it held everything. "I think we are," he said. "Though I also think you had something to do with it." "So did you," she said. "You left the lantern burning." He pressed a kiss to her temple, into her silver-threaded hair, and she turned her face up to him in the way she had been doing for 14 years, and he kissed her properly in the south field where the cornfield had been, in the place where everything had started, with the evening coming in over the Kansas prairie and the farm and the life they had made together solid and real around them. Well, Monroe found them there about 10 minutes later because he needed to ask his father something about the fencing situation on the east side, and he stopped at the edge of the field when he saw them, and he was 15 years old, and at the age when such things were theoretically mortifying. But what he actually felt, looking at his parents standing together in the evening field like that, was something that he did not have the words for yet but would have later. When he was older and had his own reasons to understand it, he went back and asked about the fence in the morning. In the summer of 1895, Will was 18 and starting to make his own decisions about the farm with the confident seriousness of a young man who knew what he wanted and had the foundation to pursue it. He and Harvey worked the farm as partners now in everything but name, and Harvey found that this was one of the more quietly satisfying developments of his life, being in the field with his son, seeing his own knowledge continuing in another person, seeing that person exceed him in some things and learn from him in others. Clara was 13 and ferocious about her education, and had written, with Esther's encouragement and Harvey's honest approval, to a school in Wichita that offered instruction to girls beyond what was available in Millard Creek. The response had been positive, and the question of whether she would go occupied the Monroe household for most of that winter in conversations that were not arguments but were very serious, and resolved in March of 1896, when Clara Monroe packed a trunk with her books and her practical nature, and took the train to Wichita with her mother riding with her on the train to see her settled. And Harvey at the station in Millard Creek, watching the train leave with the expression of a man who was extraordinarily proud, and also very much missing someone who had not yet been gone an hour. Esther came back from Wichita on the Wednesday and found him exactly where she expected to find him, which was working, in the manner of a man who processed complicated emotions through the application of physical effort. She set down her bag inside the door and found him in the barn, and she leaned in the barn doorway and watched him for a moment. "She is settled," Esther said. Harvey looked up. He had been repairing a harness that did not particularly need repairing. "Good," he said. "She already has opinions about the school," Esther said. "Of course she does," Harvey said. "She is happy," Esther said. Harvey put down the harness and looked at his wife. "Are you," he said. "Missing her already," Esther said. "But yes, this is what we raised her for." Harvey stood up and came to the barn door, and Esther moved to let him out into the afternoon light. He stood in the yard and looked at the farm, the fields and the buildings and the wide Kansas sky overhead, the same sky, more or less, that he had been looking at since 1872, 23 years of the same sky that was never exactly the same twice. "She has got your brain," Harvey said. "And your stubbornness," Esther said. "My stubbornness," Harvey said. "You stayed on this farm through 3 droughts and a blight and a winter that would have sent a less stubborn man back to Ohio," Esther said. "That is stubbornness. She has it exactly." Harvey looked at her sidelong. She was looking at the sky with her direct and unsentimental gaze, and he thought that she was right about Clara, and he was glad, and that he had been glad in various ways and for various reasons, since the morning she had stood in his cornfield at midnight and looked at the moon and said she was resting. The summer of 1895 settled into the farm with the comfortable belonging of a season that knows its place in the order of things, and Harvey Monroe drove his wagon into Millard Creek on a Saturday in July, and stopped at the general store and bought supplies and talked to Amos Whitfield, who was old now and whose son had taken over most of the running of the store, and walked past the little clapboard church where the apple tree was in full summer leaf, and drove home past the road that led south. The road a woman had walked up in the dark a long time ago, and the farm came into view in the late afternoon, and the lantern was lit in the kitchen window because Esther always lit it when he was out, always, since the first winter since he had told her about his mother's saying. He drove the wagon into the yard and unhitched the horse and went inside, and the kitchen smelled like the supper she was making, and she turned from the stove when he came in, and he put down the supplies and kissed her hello in the matter-of-fact and genuine way of people who have been kissing each other hello for 16 years and have not got tired of it. "Good trip," she said. "Amos's boy is going to raise the prices in January," Harvey said. "I bought ahead on the coffee." "Good," she said, and turned back to the stove. Harvey sat down at the kitchen table where he had sat on a February morning in 1879, and told a woman he wanted to know if two people could make something. And he looked at the lantern burning on the windowsill, and at his wife moving at the stove with the easy competence of a woman entirely at home in the life she had chosen. And he thought about the night in 1878 when he had gone out into the dark field with his rifle and his weariness and his 11 days without proper sleep, and had found, instead of a coyote, a woman in a traveling dress looking at the moon, explaining nothing. He had not been looking for anyone. He had been very wrong to think he did not need anyone. He was the most grateful man in Caldwell County, and possibly in Kansas, and possibly in the whole wide Republic of the United States of America, and he sat at his kitchen table in the evening light and let himself feel it, fully, the way he had learned to feel things since Esther Townsend had walked 2 miles in the dark and stopped in his cornfield and taken her rest. "Harvey," she said from the stove. He said, "Will is coming for supper. He wants to talk about the east pasture." "Good," Harvey said. "And I had a letter from Clara today," she said. "She has made a friend at the school, a girl named Margaret, which I find amusing." Harvey laughed because she was right that it was amusing, and because she had made him laugh more in 16 years than he had laughed in all the years before them, and it was still, every time, the best sound in the world. "What does she say about her studies?" Harvey asked. "Everything," Esther said, and he could hear the pride in her voice, unconstrained and warm, the voice she used when she was not managing what she showed but simply showing it. "She says the mathematics teacher is very good, and the literature teacher is not as good as she expected, and she intends to tell him so respectfully but directly." "She is going to be fine," Harvey said. "She was always going to be fine," Esther said. "She is ours." She set the supper on the table and they sat down, just the two of them in the warm kitchen, because Will was not there yet and the house was quiet in the particular evening way of a house that had been full and was full again and always would be. The children grown and going and coming back, and the years doing what years do, which was to deepen and settle everything that was real. Harvey Monroe bowed his head and said grace, in the way he had been saying it since his mother taught him, and that he had continued through the years of being alone, and had continued after Esther arrived, and had never, not once, gotten through it without meaning it, because gratitude, he had come to understand, was not a feeling you performed at the beginning of a meal but a practice you sustained through your whole life, a daily and deliberate acknowledgement of what you had been given. What he had been given was considerable. He looked across the table at his wife, who was looking at him with the expression that was hers alone, the one she wore when she was being exactly who she was and not performing anything for anyone, the private expression, the one reserved for evenings in the kitchen and mornings before the house woke up, and the particular quality of late October light that they both loved. "Ready?" she said. "Ready," he said. They ate supper in the warm kitchen, while the Kansas evening came in through the window, and the lantern burned steadily on the sill, and Will came in a half-hour later with mud on his boots, which he left at the door because his mother had been telling him to leave his boots at the door since he was old enough to wear them. And he sat down and ate with them, and talked about the east pasture, and the condition of the fence and the price of beef in Wichita. And outside the prairie spread in every direction under a sky full of stars, enormous and old and entirely indifferent to the happiness of the people under it, which was how it had always been and was, in its way, exactly right. Because the happiness was theirs, it was not given by the sky or the land or the circumstance. It was made by two people who had arrived at each other through loss and difficulty, and the particular improbable grace of a woman standing in a cornfield at midnight with no explanation and a man who had left the lantern burning, and who had sat across a table from each other and chosen, with full knowledge of what choosing cost, to stay. That was the whole of it. That was everything. The star Harvey had watched come up in the east on that October evening 7 years before was somewhere up there still, and the farm was solid under its light, and Harvey Monroe was 31 years older than the boy who had come west with his wife and his certainty and his $200, and he was richer in every way that counted, and the lantern on the windowsill burned on into the night as it had always burned, a light in the window that meant what his mother had always said it meant. Welcome. Come in, you are not alone.